So I'm Jayden Seric, one of the co-organizers of the meetup with David. I'm a indie dev. I do full stack JavaScript stuff, GraphQL, Next, React, that sort of thing. And I'm really excited to share some stuff about preloading resolved URLs via vanilla HTTP link headers. This idea came to me probably mid-year, just out of the blue. I was sort of reading something to do with link headers, the link tag, and the preload, rel preload. And I didn't realize at first, probably like most people, that there's also a HTTP header equivalent, which is like basically the same thing. And then it just hit me like a bunch of lightning bolts that this would just be amazing to incorporate into the GraphQL schema, because that would allow you to, from the client side of things, just declaratively say, I want these fields, which are resolving asset URLs for like profile pictures, you know, things like that. You could declaratively just query, oh, I want this to be preloaded by the client. And so I got really excited. I came into work on Monday morning. I was contracting for Chroma at the time. And I was like, blah, 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 you know, talking to Tom, and I was like, oh, this would be sick, and this could do that, and you know, it would eliminate all this, and so I ended up just taking most of the week off, and I just like started putting it into my own, some of my own projects and iterating, and sort of hit against a few walls, a few gotchas and things, which we'll talk about tonight, and I ended up having to like publish some Semver minor updates to some of like my GraphQL stack. To do with Next.js and Graphql-react to get it to work. But now I'm really excited about it. I think it's a really nice, elegant, sort of unopinionated technique. And I think it translates well to like any GraphQL backend because it's vanilla HTTP header based. And I think any GraphQL schema that has like it resolves fields that have URLs to assets, particularly images, doesn't have to just be images. Anytime you're resolving a URL that might be presented on the client, it's a bit of a no-brainer to add this to the schema. I think it's really cool. So use cases, like when do you want to preload assets on the client? So if you're, you know, if you're building anything like Twitter or Airbnb, anything that might have content pictures that come from a GraphQL response and then get presented on the page, you know, this technique will mean that the images start downloading as soon as that route is the query, GraphQL query for that route is received from the server. Bang, no waterfall, all those images natively by the browser will start to load. If you have slideshow images, if you remember back in like the gnarly jQuery plugin days for slideshows, like there's a million Stack Overflow questions to do with like how do you preload your images in the set so that when you click the next buttons in your slideshow, it's not going to have that gross, you know, blink as the picture loads in. So how can you load them all up front? And even today, there's like modern situations when you might want to have some gross like client-side JS, which like gets all the pictures from a GraphQL response and like tries to manually preload them ahead of time using like image DOM like off the screen or whatever, like not actually rendering it to the page. For example, in Chroma, when you're going through your snapshots, when you're reviewing them, it tries to preload all of the snapshot images like up to 3 screens ahead. So that's, you know, I've talked about how we could use this technique to make that a bit better instead of having a lot of like client-side JS that sort of does the queries a few pages ahead, tries to pull out the pictures and then preload them manually. Just when you've got routes and you're on a profile page and you want to click into, you know, a particular listing or something, client-side images from the routes, how they currently load, the GraphQL response for that route all happens. If you're using Next.js, it might happen in get initial props. it'll come back. You know, all the rendering will happen with your React for that page. Then the image tags will get, you know, actually mutated into the DOM, at which point the browser natively knows, all right, let's go out and fetch over the network these pictures and start loading them. So there's actually a fair few things that have to happen for those first pictures to start loading on the route you're transitioning to. So if you could cut all of that sort of round process of rendering and going to the DOM, and then the browser picks up on the fact that there's some pictures to load, if you could just immediately tell without any waterfall, just stack in a nice straight line, as soon as the GraphQL response for that route comes back, the browser just fetches all the media, you can have a much better experience. So to get the head around how it works, how many people here have heard of or used the link tag with a rel preload? Cool. So more than half. That's awesome. But how many people have heard of the same thing but as a HTTP header? Cool. 2, 3, 4. All right, a few less, but it's the same thing basically, almost exactly. And in fact, if you go on MDN and you read the docs about it, it basically says this is analogous to the link tag, and they're pretty lazy about it. Now, I didn't realize that there is actually a lot of the different like link rel values available, and they've all sort of been pulled out of a hat over about 10 or 15 years of legacy web standards. There's, most of them are kind of crappy or a bit irrelevant to like what you might want in a realistic app. So DNS prefetch basically says to the client, just try and resolve all the DNS stuff, but don't actually try loading the asset itself. There's pre-connect. It gets a bit networky. I don't really know the distinction. So the two that we're really interested in is prefetching and preloading, and both are still relevant in a modern browser. Module preload and pre-render are really cool, but they're kind of edge case that might be useful to you, because that's, you know, if your GraphQL schema is like giving people a script, like an actual ES module script, or a HTML URL to something that's HTML, I think it'd be less common than just images and videos. So these are the two we're most interested in. Prefetch is when you're hinting to the browser that you might use this on a future route, generally. Like, so the browser might say, oh man, there's so many assets on this page. You know, we're already struggling for bandwidth, that we're on a crappy 2G connection. It could avoid that hint and just say it's going to do more harm than good to try and get to this now. So it's optional for the clients to actually honor this. Now, it's pretty well supported in like old school, like IE and Edge. But interestingly, modern Safari doesn't handle the older prefetch standard, which is quite frustrating. So preload is a more modern standard, and they've actually created a whole standard just for the rel preload. And it's got some extra like attributes you can put on the link tag relevant to preloading. For example, if you're preloading a CSS style sheet, you have an as attribute, and it's as styles or style, or as image if you're preloading a PNG. And right now it's up in the air. And I'm a little bit rusty, and I think the situation's changed a bit based on some of the stuff the Chrome guys are doing. But they're also looking at kind of having some of the functionality of like the picture tag, where you can have a media attribute and say if the screen is certain size or this or that. So it preloads like conditionally. We'll talk a little bit about how that might be useful. So if you're trying to pick between them, technically there is a right answer for the situation. you know, if you're just prefetching, if you're anticipating the user is going to scroll to the next story, if you're a news website and you've got like those infinite scrolling stories or something, you want to preload the pictures further down, technically it should be prefetch, because you're anticipating where the user might go in the future. Whereas if it's assets that are showing on the current story for the current URL on that current route, you could have used preload, because you know for a fact you're presenting that content to the user at that time. So there is a semantic right answer, but in practicality, so that the experience isn't crap for half of the people on the wrong type of browser, there is absolutely nothing preventing you from spamming both at the same time. So if you send a prefetch and a preload at the same time, you'll cover everyone. And realistically, most browsers will honor the prefetch, and you'll have a very similar outcome to if you had the preload. Now, having the ability to set both at once is relevant soon when we talk about the schema design, because I ended up iterating in a week about 5 different schema designs for this. When I hit a wall, I was like, oh, I didn't think of that. So this is an interesting little nuance, but there is a technical distinction between resource hints and resource directives. So a hint, the clients by spec, the browsers rather, can choose to ignore it. They can sort of heuristically decide if it's worth adhering to the hint. A directive means that it's like having an image tag on the page. There's no ambiguity. You're meant to render that to the user. So there is a resource hints standard, a spec, and it's got a bunch of the prefetch, DNS prefetch, and all this stuff. They're all technically hints up until that point. But when they decided that they wanted to have sort of one be-all, end-all rel preload as a modern approach, they've now changed it to being a directive. So if you say link rel preload this particular PNG, it's not optional. The browser's supposed to load that no matter what. So schema design for this. So you'll notice that I've grayed out this input at the top. That's because it's only an example of something really exotic that I would never need in any of my projects. But it will just illustrate why I'm calling this input an image input suffix instead of just resource hints input. That's because you want to be able to tailor this input to what kind of resource the field is. So if you had, for example, a field, you know, like analytics script field, and it resolved a URL to your company's analytics script for that particular resource or node, like you might want to have this additional option of the module preload rel, because, you know, that tells the browser to not only preload into cache that script, but actually pass the JavaScript and have that warmed up in memory. So it doesn't make sense to allow the schema by design to allow people on the client to have the option to set a module preload header on a PNG. It's like nonsensical spec-wise. So it makes sense to craft specific input objects for the type of resource that you want to apply this to, this field you want to apply it to. So 99% of the time, this resource hints image input is like is a good choice. So here's a hypothetical user type. You might have a gravatar field. This is basically exactly what I have in my projects. You know, I have other arguments on the gravatar field that resolves a URL. For example, width, height, format, these sorts of things. But for illustration, you know, we're just interested in the resource hints argument. And that's it. It's really pretty straightforward from the schema side of things. So at this point, people in their clients, they can just query a gravatar of a user and say, preload it for me, please. And that's it. So how do we actually get this to manifest and actually work functionally on the server side of things? So in the end, I found that I was copy pasting a lot of stuff to the PowerPoint, and there was like no point. Why not just show this code and its natural habitat in a real project. So if you go to whimsy.art, that's one of my own personal projects. You know, the API is publicly explorable. So I use the LTER. I don't use graphical because I support file uploads in my API. LTER, as far as an Explorer client, that's the only one. Well, the others have GitHub issues, but it's the only one functionally right now that lets you upload binary files as arguments when you're making queries. So don't be surprised when you go there and it's not graphical or GraphQL Playground. And you have to pump that endpoint in, and you'll be able to see it. So you should be able to search for that resource hints type, and you'll be able to find it. So I'll tab out now. Hang on. Cool, and I'll open this up in VS Code. All right. So this is an I don't actually write my types in my schema in SDL. I think it's the devil, but I've exported it into SDL. So this is the real schema for my API. Here's the gravatar. Like I said, there's other arguments like size and fallback. But here's my resource hints. Here is the actual type as a JavaScript GraphQL.js representation. This is how I actually author and modularize my schema. It's basically what we've already seen on the slides. So we're going to go from like the bottom up, and we're just going to bubble our way up, you know, the food chain of how this field resolves to get to the bottom of how it actually ends up sending those headers to the client. So if we follow the breadcrumbs, here's the resolver for my gravatar field on my user type. So here's where the arguments are coming in. And you'll notice here, this is important. This link header is set on the GraphQL context in the result. Is this the right size? I can make this a bit bigger. Yeah. So we're, you know, up until this point, we're just generating a URI. Just according to the gravatar spec. So if the resource hints input object is specified, and at first when I was implementing this, I had like an enum, and I just, you know, oh, is it a link? Is it this? Is it that? And then that didn't work, because what if you want both? And then I was like, oh, so it could be an array of that same enum. So you can just arbitrarily specify a bunch. But then I thought, oh, then what's in that enum? You know, you might be able to put nonsense ones on an image, you know. So in the end, like if the resource hints prefetch argument is specified, then I've got a helper here. Now this link header set unique is not strictly needed. It's just a little abstraction that I've done just to make sure that I'm not going to add the same. You know, think hypothetically, you might have the same user node in 10 places in your graph in one query. And if, you know, you're resolving the gravatar in 10 places in one request, you don't want the same header to get set 10 times if it's identical. So all this does is just checks if it's on the context, the link header context, if it's already got that exact URI and rel combination, don't put it in. Just use the old one. Where are we up to? Yep. So if it's prefetch, add uniquely to this link header instance, you know, the URI with the prefetch rel. Additionally, if preload is also Boolean specified, then set a unique preload version. But because we know that this field is an image, we're hard coding it as an image. So at this point, you wonder, well, what is this context, this instance on the context? So here is where I'm constructing my GraphQL-react. A lot of this would be fairly similar in an Express app, but this is done like the super Koa way. So they've got like Onion middleware, which means we can do something really cool here. So here's where I'm setting up the error handling middleware. Here's my GraphQL uploading middleware. Now this is where I'm putting in the link header related stuff. And then further down, that's where the execution middleware is. So what this means with, if you're unfamiliar, show of hands, who's familiar with Koa middleware and the onion style of middleware? All right, cool. So it's not too exotic to the audience. So here, we're setting on the state, the apps, the Koa app state, a new link header instance. What is that? A link header is basically coming from this package, an npm package. All it does, it's a class that allows you to just like set on the instance a bunch of link headers as JavaScript objects, and then at the end, it's got like a method that's like string print it, and it just turns it into one big link header like string representation that you can then pump onto the actual response. Super simple conceptually what it does. It's just storing up all of the link headers you want. So the way that the header spec works, you have one link header, and then there's like a syntax of like comma separating all the ones that you want for all the different pictures or videos or whatever they are. We then await all of the resolving of the GraphQL further down. So after we've progressed past that next, that means all of this following middleware's run, which includes GraphQL execution. So at that point, we're really just putting the cherry on top on our response. We're setting a link header and we're pumping out that to string. Does that making sense up until this point? Cool. Where the execute middleware is, all we have to do then, and this is my own, so I've written my own GraphQL server. I don't use Apollo or anything, or I've written my own for Koa. And the way that you override on request, like you've set a context on the GraphQL execution, there's an override argument. So here I'm just pulling from the Koa app state. You know, I'm pulling in a bunch of other loaders and user and stuff, but here's the link header, and I'm just putting it into the GraphQL context here. So if you're using Apollo server or something, there'd be a similar way to put it onto the context there. And that is the implementation. Here it is. I don't want to lose this, but this is what the app will look like on a user's page. There's like artworks and things. When you load this page, and this is all a bit gross and gnarly because I have to like empty the cache and stuff to like see this working properly. But you can see in evidence before I clear this one. So last time the GraphQL query went out, and you can see in the response to that GraphQL query, here's the link that was set, and it's put on there at preloading as image all of the pictures that is on Jake's profile page. So what that means is that at exactly the time that GraphQL response came back, like exactly, suddenly bang, all the images are loaded at the same time and like by the browser in parallel. So it doesn't have to wait for that to end up being rendered to the DOM and then just realize, oh, there's some pictures to do. It can just start happening in the background. And this, so if I refresh, I'll go to a different page. I'll refresh, clear the cache. And then I'll navigate to it to like my profile. No, I have to refresh now to load all of the old assets for the app in general. Now I'll clear the network. All right, now I'll transition the route to my profile page for the first time. So down here, where we've got the GraphQL response. So I have a GraphQL query for the header, global header, and then I have a GraphQL query that happens for each page route itself. That's how I break up the queries. So you can see here the link header has preloaded the image on the page, and there's only this one image for me. So you'll just notice that as you navigate around, see if I can go back to Jake's page, the images really quickly, they just seem to load and just appear really nicely. Let's go back into the keynote. This was the first gotcha. So show of hands, how many of you at server-side rendering your apps? Keep your hands up if it's Next.js. Most, all right. So if you are server-side rendering all your GraphQL queries for a particular route, that means that your backend is receiving all these nice link headers. And the client is not the one that's actually sending out the GraphQL request. So the client's not going to receive these nice headers, and the browser's not then going to know to go and start preloading a bunch of stuff. So to get this whole thing to work in a server-side rendering situation, the server has to, when it's like doing all its GraphQL requests, it needs to be aware at the end of all of the different queries that it's gone off and requested. It needs to now keep it like a memory of all of the headers that it receives that are relevant, that you'd want actually forwarded, because there's a bunch of like link rel headers that aren't specifically a resource hint or a resource directive. Other stuff like rel next is like pagination stuff and like other things. So we don't want to interfere with other things. We just have a whitelist. We want to forward then to the response that the Next.js actually sends to the client. So that way the browser knows to start loading. So as far as I'm aware, this is the first GraphQL sort of server-side rendering implementation that actually supports this out of the box. It'll just magically work. So if you're using GraphQL-React and Next.js, you don't even need to think about it. You just use the decorator that's exported on the app, and that gets you GraphQL in your app, and it'll just forward these headers for you. If you're curious about the implementation, it's up on GitHub, so you can see how it goes about doing that. So you could then like apply that to some other environment. The next gotcha is picture tags. So when you are querying from, or when you're resolving the fields for, say, like a slideshow or something on the page, if you're using the picture tag, you might have a URL for the WebM asset and then a separate URL for the PNG asset. Now, if you're doing your picture tag sourcing, source tags and stuff, right, the browser should only actually fetch and display the optimal format. So that you don't want the server to be pushing all of these directives to preload all these PNGs when on Chrome, you actually just want the whiz-bang WebM. And you don't want to be forced down your throat to start fetching off everything again as a PNG. So this is actually quite a conundrum, to be honest, quite a conundrum. What I've decided on is just pick my favorite and preload that. So I'm preloading all the WebMs. And if you're using some old Safari or IE, you download two things, which doesn't really faze me a huge deal. And this is all pretty like progressive as well, in the sense that if the browser is super old and it doesn't understand these headers at all, it doesn't really matter. Like, because at the end of the day, if the picture like just loads in on demand instead of being pre-ready to go, like it's not really a very disruptive experience. Now, this situation hypothetically there might be some really cool, innovative way you could work around this once the preload directive specification handles media queries and things properly, like the picture tags and stuff do now. I don't know how your server-side rendering environment would know the type of client and what types of things it can do. Like, I don't know if maybe in the very beginning, but before you, like when you actually, you could dynamically maybe generate the query itself to not ask for certain like field arguments to be preloaded or prefetched. Like if you know beforehand in a cookie or something what the client is, like you could have the queries are dynamic to the client. I don't know, but honestly, you know, worst case scenario, just don't use it for things where you're having two different formats. You know, this is just a bonus. It's, you know, so for Gravatar, they don't have WebP. So it's fine. It's a no-brainer to preload. There you go. That's the talk. Any questions? Yeah.
Just about the performance improvements. Have you measured what sort of performance improvements you might get on average? Like a lot of the time between receiving a network request, processing it to the DOM might only be 16 milliseconds.
Yeah, it can be about that. And I guess it would be hardware dependent and stuff, because it's the image loading is blocked, I guess, by how like fast all the rendering happens, and potentially passing certain split bundles for that route that also might be being downloaded and passed in parallel to the GraphQL request going out. So it's like really how long's a piece of string. But from my own sort of just curious like refreshing on my project, I was noticing, I don't want to tell lies because I can't remember very well, but it was like tens of milliseconds. It wasn't like seconds, but it was, I think that this technique really shines when you have like the way GraphQL itself shines. You don't want to have a lot of really complicated client code. Like I was having to dig around in with Chroma, like to try to manually have JavaScript preloading images and, you know, out of, you know, JSON for screens ahead and have a lot of client logic. So with this approach, you can just declaratively say in your query, just please preload this, 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 and this, and it'll just happen natively. So I think the benefit in performance is more when you have things like slideshows where, you know, you want to preload without having to have a bunch of JavaScript in your bundle. Yeah. I wanted to show it to you on the screen as well, but then I would have had to have had a local environment for a demo, and that's always a bit troublesome because I then have to like go and edit the code to like blank out those resolvers and then try it again. And as you saw, it's really fiddly having all these requests everywhere and try and like see what's going on. Any other questions? Cool. All right. Oh, one more.
So you said it's included sort of out of the box with your next GraphQL implementation.
Yep.
What if you just wanted to put that code into something else? Do you have something available for that, or is it just sort of, how do you go about that?
So when it comes out of the box, that's where you have like that server-side rendering library, specific like a helper implementation for integrating like your GraphQL client in a Next.js project. So that's sort of like that layer that sits in the middle, and that's unopinionated. So however the GraphQL server goes about sending these headers in the GraphQL response, like there's only one native specified HTTP header way of doing that. So that's pretty unopinionated that would be helpful for whatever the GraphQL API is. The code that's on the client in that middle layer is like, I don't know if it's very isolatable. So if you've looked at the Apollo Next.js decorator, it's kind of a bit similar what happens in the sense that you're like pre-rendering that page, and then afterwards you're sort of extracting the cache from the client. So in here, you know, we're sort of just remembering all the response, like we're storing all of the headers off all the responses, deduplicating them. If you might have like 3 separate queries that are all happen in parallel and they all might have a similar header, you have to like dedupe them, which is it's relatively straightforward if you can look and cheat in hindsight and look at the code. It's like not very much, but there were like, you can't always assume that the URL is being used in the same way in all the different ones. Like I'm trying to think of examples. They're eluding me right now, but you might have different arguments on the preload. For example, one might be as an image and the other might be as a document or something like.
Just to continue the question, I guess the parts that you showed us that were involved in wiring up your server to support this.
Yep.
I mean, there wasn't a great deal of code involved in doing that, but I suppose like in terms of providing a sort of spec on how to approach that, do you have anything like that available?
I've been in, so I got really salty when I had this idea and I got really excited, and I actually suspect with no evidence whatsoever that maybe like talking with some of the Chroma guys, and maybe it just like, but it just so happens to be that 2 weeks after I got really excited about all of this, that guy tweeted the idea about it, and I got a bit salty because I wasn't the first to tweet the idea, even though I had proof in the pudding that I'd like done it a few weeks earlier. So, but I have been intending for a long time to write like a proper seminal blog post, like instructing step by step how to set all this up. But I think it won't benefit you guys, because all you really need to know is like sort of the goal of what you want to achieve. And it's each little piece of that puzzle is actually really quite trivial. It's only total less than 20 lines of code and the full stack to do it. So I think it might benefit people who haven't heard this talk though. I intend to write a blog post. Yeah.
That's awesome. I suppose where I see a lot of the value of sort of pushing these client concerns to GraphQL is where we can reuse it across platforms inclusive of our sort of native app environments as well.
Mm-hmm.
Have you considered how these headers could be honored by, or can they be honored by native applications? Have you sort of done any thought in that area?
Great question. And I just don't know. I don't have experience with the native environment to tell. Like these headers don't do anything in Node, so it's not wasteful when you're server-side rendering in a Next.js app. You know, in the Node environment, when it receives these headers, it doesn't say, oh, great, let's go download a bunch of pictures to the server. It just ignores it because the fetch polyfill in Node just doesn't even know what to do with it. So I don't know if that's how like some of the React Native like might behave towards it. It'll be like, oh, you know, great, I don't care about these headers. Or if it is smart and it's like, I don't know how the browser works with the cache. Good question though. You should let me know when you figure it out. Cool. Well, let's wrap it up then.